and VP of Ogilvy Mather, and the indisputable King of Adland, Mr. Rory Sutherland.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks ever so much. Just a very short talk, because I'm here really as the warm-up man for one of my heroes, Mark Lewis, who is, I think, in his efforts to found and refound the School of Communication Arts, has made one of the most important contributions to London Adland directly and more widely, the creative scene and the creative thriving of London that we've seen in quite a few years. And he, just to mention, there are a few people in life I've come to really admire. One of them, as I said, is Mark. The other one was probably my early influence, which is when I was at university, there was a mature student who was studying architecture in the year below me. He was, at the time, I think, 45 years old, younger than I am now. But to my horror, looking back in retrospect, we all used to call him Gramps. Because, of course, when you're a bunch of students aged about 19, someone of 45 is almost impossibly old. He was marked out from the other students at the time, partly through having a Bentley, which was pretty unusual. But actually it was much more interesting than that, because he was an extraordinarily interesting and original man called Ray Falk. And not only did he have a Bentley, but he also had an absolutely battered 17-year-old Talbot Solara. Now, nobody knows what that is, do you? At least nobody under 40. Was it a form of Vauxhall? What was Talbot? Can anybody remember? Anyway, there was a bizarre brand of particularly crappy car called Talbot. And he had this extraordinarily crappy Talbot, which he would alternate occasionally with the use of the Bentley. We said, Ray, why are you doing that? And he said, brilliantly, I think. He said, you need to have a really shit car to remind yourself how good the Bentley is. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about Ray is when he was 25 years old, 20 years pretty much before, actually more than 20 years before I knew him, he and his brother and one other person had organised and run from scratch the 3 Isle of Wight festivals, 68, 69 and 70. Now, obviously, the younger people among you are looking baffled. You think of this as a contemporary event. These were 3 extraordinary events. The 68 one was, I think, relatively small. I think, if I remember rightly, was Dylan at 68? Dylan might have been 6. You don't look at, sorry. You had Jimi Hendrix's last concert was performed, I think, in 1970. You had The Doors. You had an extraordinary lineup, just an unbelievable lineup of musicians. He'd organised that with his twin brother at the age of 24, 25. They'd been at home on the Isle of Wight. The reason they were on the Isle of Wight, the festivals were there, were basically because they lived there. It turned out quite well, actually, because being on an island, it forced people to leave their cars at home. So there was an accidental benefit to this. But they'd seen Woodstock on the television and just thought at the age of about 23, why don't we do something like that? Which is an extraordinary, extraordinary example. But the great thing about Ray was he was completely dissonant and surprising in his thinking about everything. He took everything from a completely eccentric standpoint or frame. Funnily enough, I'd first come across Ray when listening to the radio at the age of 15. And there was one of these tedious Radio 2 phone-ins, I think hosted by Jimmy Young. This was, bear in mind, this was more than 10 years, I think, or certainly quite a few years before I met him in person or knew of his existence. And about, 25 people, as you can imagine, rang Radio 2 to say how terrible litter was and how people who dropped litter should be put in jail and how it was absolutely awful. And the programme ended, and I only connected these two things, that he was the man who'd said it about 10 years later. The programme ended with just a thing, oh, and by the way, we had a call from a Mr. Falk in Oxford who rang to say that he thought litter was a very good thing. Now, Ray was like that. He actually thought litter was a great thing because, as he pointed out, when you go to anywhere that's really exciting, like New York, there's tons of litter. And when you go to really boring villages in the Cotswolds, there isn't any litter at all. So his argument was that litter was obviously at least a byproduct and possibly a cause of something really quite remarkably good. And he had this eccentric point of view on everything. Sometimes it caused offence. I remember a Cambridge Union debate where he stood up in the presence, I think, of a left-wing trade unionist and said that he thought that actually job losses were marvellous news because they were releasing the population from wage slavery and encouraging them to do something more imaginative instead, rather than working for pay. But actually, I've always held this view that actually, you know, whether you have one really crap car to remind yourself of how good your other car is, that actually Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner, puts it very beautifully. He says, always invert. Always imagine that the opposite of what everyone assumes is true may be the truth. And look for reasons for the opposite point of view. Because there's a very strong thing, those of you who know my obsession with behavioral economics will be familiar with this, there's a very strong thing called confirmation bias. We form a very early opinion of something, and then we basically go around looking for corroborative evidence. That's why that phrase, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, is kind of true. Because we very, very rapidly form an impression of someone within about 7 seconds of meeting them. And if our first impression is lovely bloke or asshole, we basically just go around selectively hoovering up whatever evidence confirms our largely arbitrary first impression. Because life's just too damn difficult if we have to reassess everything all the time. This is very important, by the way, in the customer service business, if you're in the business of experience design, website design for that matter, which is the very beginning of an experience is extraordinarily important. There were some statistics I shared with Dan Ariely from someone who did customer satisfaction surveys for a large hotel in Memphis. And what they found was that pretty much all the impressions of the hotel, all the comments, were enormously conditioned by how good the check-in experience was. So if you arrived and there was a big queue in check-in and you had to wait for ages because there were, you know, 50 people in front of you in a queue before you could get your room keys, you basically made a decision at that point that the hotel was shit and went around looking for reasons to believe it was crap. Equally, if you had a great check-in experience, you thought, I'm in a really good mood here, I like this place, and you went around looking for things to love. To be honest, our relationships with the opposite sex probably take much the same shape. But what was so interesting about that was that when people had a bad check-in experience, it wasn't just that questions like, what did you think of the service? Or, you know, did you like the hotel overall? Which would reasonably be correlated with the check-in experience. Other utterly unrelated things like, what do you think of the quality of the food? Or in the most abstruse case, what do you think of the ice sculpture in the garden? Okay? Now, if they'd had a bad check-in experience, they basically replied, I thought your ice sculpture was shit. Okay? Now, that's really, really interesting. Always invert. And I've seen a couple of cases of this very recently where someone looks at something from absolutely the opposite point of view. Now, I don't expect everybody to share this opinion, but I think some of you should just hold this opinion experimentally for maybe half an hour every day and see where it gets you. Which is that actually, for anybody in a creative industry, the recession is actually rather like litter in New York. It's a jolly good thing. Yeah. Okay? Now let me explain this. First of all, if you look at inventiveness, human inventiveness in general, it always comes out of necessity or desperation, not abundance. The single most fertile period of innovation in terms of ideas and improvements and technical improvements the world's ever seen was probably the United States in the 1930s. If you look at statistics on which countries produce the most patents per head and the most really worthwhile research per head and as a proportion of GDP, it's the Scandinavians by some measure. And until the Norwegians recently discovered oil, when you think about it, the Scandinavians have gone absolutely bugger all in terms of natural resources. You've got wood, okay? Does anybody, as a complete aside, does anybody watch that 12-hour Norwegian documentary on firewood? How many people? Seriously, if you want experimental footage, it's brilliant. I mean, about 8 hours of it just shows the fire burning, okay? With occasionally a hand coming in to place a log on top of the fire. It aroused a large number of complaints in Norway, not because it was boring. No, they were actually captivated by it. But a lot of people were scandalized by the fact that they saw the firewood being stacked bark down after the logs were split, and they were convinced it was much better to stack firewood bark up. And apparently in Norway, this is the kind of thing that really divides people. If you're looking for a fight in a Norwegian car park, that's the kind of thing that gets them going. But I'll go back to that point, that the recession is a good thing. Arguably, the reason Latin America is historically poorer than North America is precisely because Latin America had gold. North America didn't have anything, so they had to invent things. If it isn't necessity that's the mother of innovation, desperation will do. Fear, paranoia, all those things will kind of do. Now that sounds a really strange thing to say. Great films tend to be produced, actually. Great culture tends to be produced not at times of huge material abundance in many cases, but at least in situations of great uncertainty and confusion. But I'd like to say that one of the things I have noticed, now I don't know how many people share this opinion, but I've found generally as a creative person, the receptivity you get now coming up with creative ideas is vastly better than it was during that artificially engineered economic boom in the sort of 15 years in the run-up to 2008. Because actually, there are only really two ways to improve the world, one of which is to do more with more, which is, broadly speaking, the economist's solution, and then there's the creative person's solution, or the designer's solution, which is how do we do more with less? And of course, when you have absolutely abundant flows of artificial capital being generally spunked into the economy by bizarre banking mathematics, which makes no sense whatsoever, the need to do more with less isn't really there. The entire mentality is, let's do what we did last time and do more of it to a more extreme degree. Because after all, it's seemed fine for the last 2 years. Now, if you read the book Anti-Fragility by Nassim Taleb, he makes the same point that I would make, although with far, far more intellectual justification, which is that frequent mild recessions are good for an economy. That economies, like human health, like most complex systems, are what he calls anti-fragile entities, which is they are strengthened by mild stressors. So his argument was that the whole Gordon Brown thesis of no more boom and bust is actually a recipe for catastrophe. That if you get continuous, uninterrupted economic growth for a period of 15 years, you haven't abolished bust, you're simply heading for a really, really big one. I mean, I met Nassim Taleb, and he makes some very strange points about human health, for example. He thinks that very mild smoking is probably good for you. Now, that seems completely eccentric as a viewpoint, until you realize that quite a lot of the reason that quite a lot of vegetables, for example, are healthy, coffee may be healthy, is, of course, that vegetables have evolved the ability to produce insecticides to protect themselves against insect eating. Caffeine, nicotine, and quite a lot of things you find in vegetables, plants, and leaves are actually mildly poisonous. The plants are not poisonous to humans, but they're poisonous enough to deter insects from generally consuming them. And that actually very mild ingestion of poisons fairly regularly is probably pretty good for us. And in the same way, in an economy, regular but relatively mild recessions are good for an economy. They purge it of businesses that shouldn't exist and should clear the way for better growth of better ideas. And also, you create a reliable feedback mechanism. If every stupid business idea succeeds and can find capital and funding from everybody for 10 or 15 years, how do you tell which ideas are stupid? Because they all seem to survive. Warren Buffett put it very beautifully. He said, it's only when the tide goes out that you can see who's been swimming naked. So that's my first point, that actually we should do what my friend Ray does and look at this in a decidedly eccentric point of view. That actually, culturally, in terms of the appetite for creative innovation, recessions are actually pretty good news. That when you have less, there's another counterpoint of view which I read in the New Statesman, which is not my normal reading, but you always read the opposite political view to your own. And what you'll find in the New Statesman is that a lot of thinking on the left and the right is converging, and a lot of it is surprisingly sane. And the point of the New Statesman, which I thought was quite serious, is they said that surely, to be completely fair, George Osborne should be a hero of the environmental movement. Since if he's managed to engineer 0% growth for a long period of time, isn't this what environmentalists want? I mean, the whole point of the Green Movement is that a future for the world predicated on endless increases in consumption of stuff can't be entirely healthy or good. So actually, by engineering a reasonable society which actually doesn't grow, but which improves not through the consumption of more stuff, but by the better use of the stuff we already have, isn't that really rather a good thing? Now, you don't often get the New Statesman praising George Osborne, and admittedly, I think there was probably a little bit of a backhanded compliment in the thing, but it's actually quite a valid point of view when you look at it. Now, what's interesting about this, and this particular period, is not only the recession. It's also the fact that somebody, and I don't know who, had the genius idea of creating the phrase creative industries or creative sector. Why is that really important? Because you can't something doesn't exist until there's a name for it. If you create a name for something, you create a kind of norm. Now, the most brilliant marketing example of this was pursued by, I think it was a group of people at the Harvard Drink Driving Project, who invented the phrase designated driver. It was a group of highly imaginative marketers who said, we'll invent this phrase designated driver. In Holland, nobody here Dutch, is that all Belgian? Anybody speak Flemish? What's Bob stand for? Do you know? It's something like... Who's your designated? It's actually an acronym or a backronym. And in Holland, the designated driver is called Bob. The reason I'm drinking Diet Coke is because I'm Bob this evening. When you set out for a night on the Lash in Brussels, if such a thing exists, you say, who's going to be Bob this evening? It's something like Berühmte Oberste Besuchte, is that right? It means deliberately sober driver, and it means Bob. In the US, they created designated driver. They went to Hollywood, and they got the phrase designated driver injected into lots of sitcoms, lots of soap operas, lots of comedies. So it just entered the language. Once you've got a name for something, you've got a norm. And first of all, it created the impression, because there's a word for this thing, that actually maybe we should have one. When you couldn't say, who is the person who is going to intentionally remain sober this evening in order that the rest of us can, you can't do it. Once there's a name for something, apparently this is Wittgenstein, or late Wittgenstein makes this point, that actually much of our thinking is arbitrarily controlled by the things we have vocabulary for and the things we don't. But by creating this phrase Bob, or this phrase designated driver, suddenly it became seen as a perfectly normal thing to do. And actually that business of creating words to give permission, I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at older people, the phrase downsizing in terms of property is actually a really useful phrase. Because previously, before downsizing existed, there was always a bit of a stigma for people in their 60s to move out of their house into a smaller house, because people basically assumed they were broke. Whereas if you just said, no, we decided the time had come for us to downsize, that then seems like a choice, not a compromise. And this invention of the creative sector is really, really important, because conceptually, in the mind of government and policy, and in just the minds of people writing about economics, the creative sector didn't exist until that phrase was invented. Yes, of course, the whole business existed. You had everything from, I think, it embraces everything from filmmakers to photographers to the advertising industry and so forth. At some extensions, it extends to antiques dealers, but I think that's probably stretching it. Unless they're faking antiques, of course, in which case they belong fully in the creative sector. But what's quite interesting is now you suddenly create this name for the thing, people can actually look at it. And what you see is that it's probably bigger than the hospitality industry. Some people say it's larger than finance. Obviously not as big as retail or manufacturing, which are ginormous, okay? But it's pretty damn big. 26 billion a year it earns in the UK, £70,000 a minute. It accounts for 10% of the UK's exports, and interestingly, that's a higher proportion of any economy in the UK than anywhere else in the world. Quite interesting that the creative sector is actually more dominant in the UK than anywhere else. If you look at that and that seems strange to you, bear in mind that of the four really, really valuable franchises, which I guess are Star Wars, actually I think in order it goes Harry Potter, Star Wars is number 3, Bond's number 4, and The Lord of the Rings is number 2. If you think of them, 3 out of those 4 are based on UK properties. Sherlock Holmes, which is probably the most enduring and reused property ever created, the most reused franchise. Any fans of Elementary and so forth? Yeah, good, excellent. I mean, that's probably the most enduring one. That's also British in origin. We just seem to be very good at this stuff, which is good to know. And actually that's rewarded. But that fact was completely unrecognized by government or by journalists in The Economist until someone came up with the phrase. What else is actually really good about a creative economy? One of the things is it creates a culture where people try and do more with less, which in environmental terms has to be good, I think. There's another interesting value, of course, for a creative economy, which often gets captured by estate agents. Has anybody heard this? That a very common strategy for estate agents is you basically stalk artists, and where they move to, you buy up all the property. Because in urban regeneration, creative people are absolutely essential. Why? Because if you're a banker, you want a really expensive house in a really expensive street that's already really expensive, okay? Bankers basically compete with each other rivalrously. Creative people compete with each other almost through game theory, through outwitting other people rather than outspending them. And so creative people don't go and say, I want to buy a really big house in Kensington. They do the opposite. They go, I want to go and discover a place where nobody has yet spotted the value. And so that's the great distinction. Rather than saying, I want a really valuable house on a really expensive street, okay, the creative mentality is different. It fundamentally says, I basically want to realize value where no one else has spotted it. And that's a much more creative form of value creation and actually more valuable, even if it ends up being estate agents who make the money. That's a much more interesting approach. So it's a very interesting approach because the creative mentality extends to its attitude to property, which is it's asking the question not what is this and what's it worth, but what could it be worth? What can I make of this? And so it's interesting how that fundamentally different mentality, that thing of doing more with less, seems to actually manifest itself in all kinds of creative behavior. Intangible value, as I said, is great. It takes a lot of effort to realize this. We have deep within us a thing which Steven Pinker, any fans of Steven Pinker, the blank slate, he calls basically the physical fallacy, that we're much more comfortable paying for things that are physical than seeing value in things that are intangible. And he extrapolates from that all sorts of things like violence against shopkeepers, whether it might be Korean shopkeepers in Watts or Chinese shopkeepers in Malaysia or Jewish shopkeepers in Eastern Europe. Why? Because the shopkeeper doesn't make anything. He adds huge value, but he adds the value in intangible ways through storage, scale, and transportation, okay? And distribution. It's a form of value. You know, a bunch of bananas 200 miles away from where I live has very little value to me. The shopkeeper delivers that value by making it accessible at any time I like, whenever I want it. But we tend to think that because the value is created in a way that doesn't actually involve the manufacture of stuff, that it actually somehow is earned at our own expense. And we tend to look at intangible value with a very, very strong bias against it. I would argue, and actually a very, very good economist at Oxford, who's an environmentalist, also takes my point, that strangely the advertising industry and the environmental movement, which are never seen as natural bedfellows, actually have some extraordinarily close things in common. Because the more you can get people to pay for intangible value, for perceived value, for belief, for narrative, for stories, for things that don't involve any raw materials, and the less, therefore, you need to provide stuff to justify their expenditure, then you are actually creating value out of nothing, and basically meaning doesn't create any CO2. Perceived value doesn't create any CO2. So there's a quite interesting new thinking. Once you accept the fact that actually marketing that intangible value is just as valid as any other kind and overcome the physical fallacy, what you'll find is that actually some surprising new people come into your purview. You know, suddenly advertising will be used not just to sell things, it will also be used to solve interesting problems. The revolution in the behavioral sciences really, really helps this. And that's a really vital point, that suddenly one of the worst aspects of the sort of boom up until 2008 was you had a period where everything was about efficiency and scale and how much and how big. And genuinely, for a 10 to 15 year period, and I was working in advertising throughout that time, psychology completely fell off the consideration set for any government department. That was considered irrelevant. The idea that how you present something affects how people react to it was basically dropped. I gave the example, I don't know if you've probably heard me say this before, of the student loan system. In Australia, they have a basically identical system, but they call it a graduate tax. So the government pays for you to go to university, but if you end up earning more than a certain amount of money, you pay more in income tax to pay back the cost of your education. You're a Kiwi, aren't you, I think? But I don't think anybody in Australia rioted. Because most people go, well, that seems pretty fair to me, okay? You know, you go to university, the government pays for you to study medicine, you end up earning 140,000 a year as an anaesthetist. It doesn't seem altogether unreasonable that you should pay a bit back for the education you received. But that was when it was called a graduate tax, which almost sounds like a status symbol. When you call it a loan, first of all, you introduce people to 15 years of misery while they spend their time at university with this massive millstone hanging over their head. And the entire emotional reaction to that thing is determined not by what the financial mechanism is, but how you describe it. Similarly, a loan will massively deter people from poorer backgrounds from going to university. Because if your net household wealth is £4,000, the prospect of borrowing 20 is terrifying. If you go to that same person and say, if you end up earning £50,000 a year, you'll have to pay more tax, their reaction is, chance to be a fine thing. So the idea that actually our senses have evolved to give us an objective view of the world is the most dangerous delusion that it's possible to imagine. We don't. We perceive things according to a frame, according to comparison, according to utterly bizarre mental biases and frames. And the idea that all you have to do to improve the reaction, that actually what you call something is irrelevant, that all we care about is what it is one of the most dangerous delusions which has done extraordinary harm. So again, one of the great things I can see for creative people is the explosion in the social sciences and in our understanding of people and how they act and how they decide creates not only just more jobs for people in the creative sector, it massively broadens the remit of people in advertising, which I think is terribly exciting. I put it very crudely myself. I said, when I just talked about advertising, I went to advertising conferences. When you talk about behavioral economics, you get invited to Downing Street or the Cabinet Office or the HMRC. Suddenly, you know, this actually provides a huge opportunity and a huge chance for marketers and advertising and people in what you might call the social sciences who actually believe that psychology matters to seize back a few of the levers of power and decision-making from the economists and accountants who've basically used spreadsheets and maths to grab control of organizations and seize complete control of most decisions. I genuinely see the recession combined with advances in this kind of thinking as being an opportunity to redress that balance back to some kind of sanity. A few other things, which is just that one of the great things about the creative sector, which both enthuses me and worries me, this probably ought to be my last point. I don't want to rumble on too long. I mentioned your contribution to urban regeneration. Two things. One of them is the experience economy. Those of you who are Gen Y, when I was about 17 or 18, the single greatest concern and obsession I had is what car you had, because that was what it was like if you grew up in the Welsh borders in 1983, okay? What's interesting is Gen Y, particularly urban cosmopolitan Gen Y, see cars as a utility. I've got two friends now who are taking their driving test, and the driving instructor says, what car do you plan to buy when you've passed? They said, I'm not planning to buy a car. Well, why are you taking the test? They said, zip car. Okay? So the fundamental change in consumption patterns is actually happening. Now, why is this? Two little explanations. First of all, I suppose it comes from Marshall McLuhan, who says we shape our tools and then we fashion our tools and then our tools shape us. That the media we use affect our behavior. The second one is my friend Geoffrey Miller, who's a Darwinian psychologist, wrote a very good book called The Mating Mind, who makes the point that actually the net thing that people seek for is not necessarily money or possessions. It's some form of indicator of status or intelligence or openness, or basically the display of personality is an innate human urge. Now, as he said, interestingly, once you invent Facebook and you invent Twitter, it becomes possible to share experiences. So actually, whereas very few people remember this. Those of you who are over 45 will dimly remember this, that in the sort of 1960s or 70s, if someone went on a foreign holiday, they'd actually force their friends to come around to their house and show them slides, okay? Nobody really enjoyed it except the people who are showing off these things. But it was felt that the foreign holiday kind of warranted this kind of sharing. Suddenly what you realize among Gen Y is that actually they're just as likely to derive identity and status and meaning from things they are doing, intangibles, than from buying, possessing, and displaying stuff. So whether it's attending events, I have to say, I think the behavior goes a bit too far when it comes to people posting on Facebook pictures of cakes they've made. Does anybody else think that's actually overstepped the mark? I don't want to see your cakes. May just be me. But actually, suddenly, the means they're using to signal are vastly more likely to involve intangible experience economy things than the purchase of stuff. And that has huge implications for, I suppose, consumerism, for advertising, but also massively for the creative industries, because they're using the products of the creative industries to signal and signify their tastes. So what we may see, because of Twitter and Facebook and so forth, and completely unintended by them, is a massive shift in consumption away from tangible physical status goods and towards what you might call experience and creative goods. So that's another reason to be optimistic. The final thing, which is both good and bad, which is at its best is the best thing about the creative sector, is nearly all well-paid jobs are looking for the same kind of people with the same narrow band of cognitive, slightly nerdy skills that banks look for, accountancy firms look for. The great thing about the creative industries is that they, fascinatingly, can, at their best, draw talent and realize talent and discover talent absolutely anywhere. You know, brilliant people who've actually, never even studied the subject in question suddenly prove themselves extraordinary. People with no postgraduate or graduate qualifications can actually rise to the top in the advertising industry. The only problem you have, and that still I think remains great, that I think the creative industries can, if you think about it, there's this sort of narrow, weird, self-appointed, university-educated elite which now hog all the best jobs and then erect educational barriers to other people. It's basically pulling up the ladder after yourself. Now, I'm very questioning about this because I said to Ogilvy, is there any evidence? All these firms say we want people with a 2-1 or above. And I said, well, that's a bit ridiculous because only half the people by definition can get that. And I said, is there any evidence that people with a 2-1 or above are any better or more successful than people with a 2-2 or below? No. If anything, it runs the other way. Okay? But nonetheless, that just seems a sort of rational way to choose. And so this source of great employment and great jobs in most sectors, whether it's law, any of those professions, medicine, for example. There's a university in Canada which actually doesn't demand medical qualifications before they train you up to be a doctor. And they find that the people, they simply choose you on how keen you are to become a doctor. And they're mildly more successful than everywhere else. The only problem we have, and I'm going to end on this note, with the creative sector, is this one thing. Because success in it is so uncertain compared to dentistry, compared to accountancy, and it's becoming more uncertain as we globalize. It's becoming more extreme. So to give you an example, the average salary of an author is about the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago. Until you strip out J.K. Rowling and Dan Brown, and you strip out their earnings, which are distorting the average, and now you find the average salary for remaining authors has halved. So the gains disproportionately go to one end of that kind of inverse square rule. And that makes creative jobs very uncertain and nervy, because when you train as an accountant or a dentist or whatever, there is a kind of career ladder, which is if you fail to fuck up, you will make it to the top. Our business isn't like that, which is why you see the whole creative sector becomes, if we're not careful, dangerously full of the children of the rich. Okay, that's the problem, because if you've got a dad with a house in, Berkshire, you can take that punt. But actually, if you've got a small child and you don't have any family money, it's too great a risk to take. So you become a dentist instead. Okay. What do we do about that? I don't know what the answer is. But we have a great opportunity in that we can find talent anywhere, and it can prove itself just as valuable. There's no particular need to restrict our fishing to a narrow pool. The only problem is are we becoming self-limiting because the career path is so uncertain? I do have one suggestion, which I'm going to end on before I call over to Mark. When they decided who was to become a Spitfire pilot, a fighter pilot, during the Second World War, they obviously had lots of people who are potential RAF recruits and so forth, and they could have done, what they would do now is they would have devised unbelievably complicated metrics, tests, and everything else to decide who got the job, okay? What they did back then was they asked 2 questions. This was the single biggest discriminator as to whether you got to fly a Hurricane or a Spitfire or not. And the 2 questions were, have you ever owned a motorcycle, and do you own one now? And the answers they were looking for were yes, no. And the reason was you were brave enough to ride a motorcycle in the first place, but sane enough to give it up. Okay? And that was the perfect mental material for a Spitfire pilot. It's a beautifully simple, creative solution to how do we find exactly the mentality we want, and it was 2 questions. I always assumed in the event of a tie, they said, does he have a large handlebar moustache and a nickname like Binky or Ginger, just to actually decide the thing finally. But that was how they decided. What a brilliant idea. So my proposal, which I haven't yet got accepted by Ogilvy, but think about this as a policy, okay, is that at any point in Ogilvy, 50% of our applicants must be people who've never been skiing. Okay? Because the great thing about skiing, if you think about it, it's proof of a privileged childhood, skiing, because as the great comedian, can I be politically correct? Does anybody watch Louis C.K., the comedian? He said, there are two things a man can't take up after the age of 30, fellatio and skiing. All right? Now, so the great thing is the only people who ski are people whose parents paid for them to ski on the grounds that once you're my age, I'm Welsh, so you can't ski. I don't know why, it's just the rules, okay? It's just wrong. It's the sport of our Saxon occupying forces. We don't do it. Is that clear? Okay? Anyway, but it obviously is proof of a privilege. The other one would be horse ownership in female employees. If you've owned a horse at any time or a pony, sorry, we can only take 50% of people like you, which is a way of actually getting complete equality and opportunity and diversity in the workforce with one really simple question. Don't buy a horse anyway. It's an absolutely stupid attempt to combine a pet with a means of transport. Okay? If you've got the money to buy a horse, go and buy an Aston Martin DB9 and a kitten. Okay? Because the kitten's a better pet and the Aston Martin DB9 is a much better form of transportation. So while you're trying to combine these two things, it's like a sofa bed, okay? It's neither a sofa nor a bed. Don't do it. So I'm going to end on that, but one of the things I will say is that Mark, with his scholarships and his understanding that you need actually to create mechanisms that foster this diversity of intake, because the great thing about the creative sector is that it can find talent anywhere. It would be a tragedy if we had that huge advantage over banking and accountancy and everything else, and we fail to exploit it simply because the people we want are simply too frightened to apply. So the work that Mark's doing is miraculous and brilliant, and I commend it to you all. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Rory. We do have one more speaker. Several.